Hi everyone, and welcome to my talk on Skills for Bees Cymru, which is a bumblebee recording project for the whole of Wales. Thank you to Cofnod for inviting me to give this talk, and sorry I couldn't be there live, but I hope you'll find this really interesting, and I hope that you will feel that maybe you can get involved and help us to record more bumblebees in North Wales. Okay, so my name is Clare Flynn and I'm the Project Officer for Skills for Bees Cymru. More information available on the website there, and I'm going to tell you a few things during this talk. So we're going to cover my project and its aims and how we're going to deliver that. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about bumblebees in Wales in general, particularly our rare and scarce species. I'm going to tell you about another project which, especially if you're a recorder, you might be really interested in having a look at, and it's the Welsh landscapes for rare bees, which the local record centres have been a partner to helping us to bring that together. We're going to talk a bit about focusing our recording efforts across the North Wales region, which I need a lot of help with because I live in Pembrokeshire. So yeah, I need some keen recorders in North Wales really, and how you might like to get involved. Okay, so Skills for Bees Cymru is a 3-year project, and we're well into year 1 now, towards the end of year 1, and it's funded by a charity called the Moondance Foundation. And it built on the success of a very similar project for Skills for Bees, which ran just for a few months in 2019. And basically, when we talk about Skills for Bees, it's not actually skills for the bees, but skills for us to help identify and record the bees. So it's all based on recording and volunteer training. And the overarching aim is to improve distribution and abundance data of our Welsh bumblebees by training anybody really who wants to be trained, but primarily we get staff and individual volunteers throughout the conservation sector wanting to get involved. Another aim is to build a network of BeeWalk transects, which is the Bumblebee Conservation Trust monitoring scheme, very similar to the butterfly conservation transects. And we want to increase those across Wales to also support ongoing monitoring and recording. We've also got a focus on filling knowledge gaps, whether this be knowledge gaps about particular species, but also, really importantly, we've got huge geographical areas in Wales which have little or no BeeWalk data and actually relatively low numbers of records. So North Wales, generally speaking, is one of those areas. So hence, I'm really delighted to be giving this talk. And also we want to make sure that as a trust, the volunteers we train in Bumblebee ID and monitoring, that we actually provide ongoing support and learning opportunities for them to develop their skills over time. So we've started doing that, but we've got lots more plans of what we can provide for people, rather than just one-off sort of training sessions. And on the right there, I did get up to North Wales in partnership with Richard at Cofnod this summer, and we've got a very, very bedraggled male heath bumblebee, which was up on the frieze above Pensucnant Conservation Centre, and there's our hardy volunteers there underneath at the centre in rather damp weather. Okay, but the bumblebees were still out. Okay, so the way we're going to hopefully deliver some of these aims is to offer beginner ID training, various different aspects of intermediate training, so looking in more detail at the rarer bumblebees, etc. training in the BeeWalk monitoring scheme, and more general recording training in partnership with the local record centres, submitting, individual records and data. We're going to be offering volunteer field days, BeeWalk demo sessions in the field, and also highlighting target habitat areas for bee blitzes, where we go along in a group and kind of blitz a site to see what bumblebees we can find, and if we can find new sites for some of our rarer species in Wales. So just a little summary of 2021. We got off the mark with lots of Zoom training, and the local record centres across Wales were key partners for me in that. So we all worked together, and it was quite successful. We had lots of takers. I also worked with, excuse me, Pembrokeshire Coast National Park very closely, Wildlife Trust of South West Wales, Bug Life, the Living Level projects, lots of different partners, but those were some of my main ones. We had field training days to support our Zoom sessions, and 8 rare bee blitzes. And all of our field sessions of all types are shown there on the map. And I am sure you will see that there's something of a South Wales bias there. This is for lots of different reasons. Partly I live in South Wales, so I tend to know lots and lots of people in the recording community and in conservation. And I sort of tend to, end up delivering lots of field days there as I have so many contacts. But also around the Neath Port Talbot Bridge End area, we're working in partnership with Bug Life, and we're another big partner in the living levels down around Newport. And we also focused on the shrill carder bee populations, which occur in these 3 South Wales areas this year, because we were working within the conservation strategy for that species. But we did manage to spread our wings, which is a forerunner for the next 2 years, because that's where I hope to focus my efforts and redress this balance. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is tell you a little bit about bumblebees in Wales more generally, and the status of some of our rare and scarce species. So for those of you who don't know, we have 24 species in the UK. So I'll go back a bit. We have 8 that are common and widespread. Some of you might be familiar with those. And they're common and widespread across the whole UK, and Wales is no different. We have the cuckoo bumblebees, which are parasitic on the social bumblebees. They tend to exist at far lower numbers, which is, as it should be, because they don't want to overcome their hosts. And they tend to be very under-recorded because people are much less familiar with them, and they're very difficult to identify. Certainly, I think they're very under-recorded in Wales. And then we have the rare and scarce species. So the ones highlighted in yellow, the moss carder, the brown-banded carder, the large garden bumblebee, the shrill carder, and the red-shanked bumblebee are all Section 7 species within Wales. So they are species of conservation concern. Monticular, the bilberry bumblebee, which is, it's a species of uplands, so really important in North Wales. The picture is very mixed on that. It is relatively scarce, partly because of its habitat specialisation, thought to be declining, but we don't really know. And Bombus soroensis, the broken-belted bumblebee, is scarce, very low numbers of records in Wales, but also incredibly hard to identify. So it could well be under-recorded, and this tends to be a sort of heathland species, not exclusively, but it's another one that I think in North Wales could be incredibly under-recorded. Cryptarum and Magnus are highlighted there because they are an aggregate species with the whitetail Bombus lucorum, and those are DNA jobs really in the field. So we're not counting those in my project as such, because it's just a whole project in itself really. Distinguendus, the great yellow bumblebee, is crossed out there because that was recorded in Wales back in the early parts of the last century, but it's long since been declared extinct in Wales and now only occurs in Scotland. So we're doing well. We've got 23 out of 24 species occurring. And actually, because we have relatively more good sort of quality habitat, you know, we are quite rich for such quite a small nation in bumblebee species. It's 10% of the world's bumblebees in Wales, so that's brilliant. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to just quickly go through our section 7 species on plus 2 others, and I'm going to use the maps from the Welsh Landscapes for Rare Bumblebees project, which was done in partnership. Well, it was a contracted piece of work that the local record centres did for us, and I will give you more detail on that once I've gone through these species sort of status maps. So these are very, very up to date, and they include as many records basically as the lurks could gather together to get this information, and these are date specific. So if you like, all of the squares represent the distribution of the bee, but the yellow squares are pre-1980. Okay, the orange, which are a bit harder to see, in 1980 to 2000, and the post-2000 records are the red ones. So basically the current distribution is shown by the red squares, and the past distribution is shown by all of the squares. So you can see the squares where the bee has been lost. Okay, so Bombus muscorum was only ever really quite a restricted species, but it has reduced in distribution, and these records go right back to about 1900. It does have this sort of propensity for very species-rich grassland, and it can be found sort of in Ross pastures and wetter grasslands, quite dense grassland habitats. It's a beautiful bee, always a delight to find it. But my experience along the South Wales coast is that it tends to exist in very low numbers. Okay, because of course this map only shows distribution and not abundance. And then a sort of partner species, I suppose, Bombus humilis, the brown-banded carder. Similar distribution in that it's quite coastal. It would appear that it has lost a lot of its inland squares since before 1980, since the earlier parts of the last century. It tends to prefer open, drier, species-rich grasslands, but they do often occur together. There's a big overlap in their habitat preferences. And I must admit, having worked on bumblebees in South Wales with a lot of my colleagues in the last few years, there are some days where you see nothing but brown-banded carder, and it actually appears to be doing really, really well. Very keen to find out if we can add more squares to the map in North Wales, because this species does appear to be having a bit of a resurgence, which is nice. Okay, the red shank carder, Bombus ruderarius, I've never actually seen one in all the recording I've done in South Wales. We have got post-2000 records, and quite interestingly, you know, right up that kind of mid-Wales, it isn't just coastal. So it'd be good to explore some of these, and we've got a 110k square there on Anglesey. So again, we need lots more investigation in good areas of habitat to see where we can find this one. Oops, go back a bit. And again, those flower-rich grasslands, really, really important for this species. And a lot of these species are quite late emerging, so they you know, if you're cutting your grassland in sort of July for hay, it's not ideal for some of these rarer species, and maybe therein lies the issue of why they've declined so much. So the shrill carder, which has got a bit of a celebrity bumblebee, certainly in South Wales, that now has suffered one of the most catastrophic declines of all species in the UK, and exists in only 5 very isolated populations, 3 of which are in Wales. So we've got the population around the Newport wetlands, and I've seen lots of shrill carder there this year. Population around Bridgend, East Port Talbot, and Castle Martin in Pembrokeshire. I've recorded shrill carder at all of these populations this year, as have my colleagues, but how they're really doing, especially in the 2 more western populations, is a little bit unknown at the moment. They're hanging on. They're hanging on. And it's interesting that we, you know, never say never. It did occur further up the coast and on Anglesey and the Llŷn Peninsula in times past. So it obviously had the right habitat, you know, to support this species, which is very, very late emerging. Their queens don't come out till sort of about June time. Okay. So Bombus ruderatus, well, I've never seen one of these bumblebees, and you can see there on the map, records indicate that it was always incredibly rare in Wales, and it hasn't actually been recorded since 2002. So whether this is now extinct is up for question. And even in England, I know there are parts of England where it is doing reasonably well, and it particularly responds to wildflower mixes that farms lay down, you know, as part of countryside stewardship schemes. So it's got a chance, but whether we still have it, we don't actually know. And then just these 2 little outliers, which aren't on the Section 7 list, but really important nonetheless. Bombus sorensis. I've been wanting to find this species for about 4 or 5 years now, since I got really serious about recording my bumblebees. Maybe it's longer actually. And as you can see, it was never widespread, but it is so hard to distinguish this bumblebee from the whitetail and the bufftail actually. And so unless you've got very experienced recorders out and about, this species will be overlooked. So it could be that the distribution has been much better than those squares indicate. And you can see that the red ones, which indicate the post-2000 records, really are few and far between. So it does suggest a decline. But part of my project will be looking for Sorensis, and I'm delighted that this summer, for the first time, with my colleague, we found Sorensis behind a Pets at Home store in the midst of a commercial estate in East Port Talbot. So the most unlikely place, right in the heart of the most industrial part of the whole of Wales. And we found lots of workers and lots of males all feeding on watermint, and they were absolutely beautiful. So that was a highlight for 2021. And then Bombus monticular, which is a bit of a contrast because it is generally really easy to distinguish. It's an absolutely beautiful species. You know, the queens particularly are associated with flowering bilberry, and they come out in about May time. The workers and the males are much more generalist. So once the bilberry's over, they'll feed on pretty much anything they can find. And there are suggestions. There is some decline. You can see it doesn't stay in the uplands. It does enjoy coastal grasslands, coastal heath as well. These records in Pembrokeshire are all mine. I found the species about 5 years ago for the first time in the county, and it's actually right across the Preseli Hills in Pembrokeshire. And I think this gap, I think it's under recorded as well. So this gap in Ceredigion, Brecon Beacons, well, I think, you know, this is another species, even though we've got a reasonable distribution map, I think we could probably fill in more squares. So we shall see. Okay, so I'm going to just give you a little bit more detail of where those maps came from. So when my project started, Skills for Bees Cymru, or when they were perhaps planning it, I should say, before it actually started, we realised that there were these huge gaps in knowledge across Wales, and we also realised that the current data, or the data at that time, back in about 2020, was sort of held in quite a few different places. So it wasn't just the lurks, you know, NRW had some data, and there were other bits and projects that had been done. So part of the preparation for Skills for Bees Cymru was to do a record trawl, a data trawl, if you like, and funding was obtained to commission this work, where all the known data would be requested and pulled together. And we were delighted that the local environmental record centres applied for this piece of work, and it was awarded to them because they were in the best position to do the job. And it's absolutely fantastic for me, because what they've done can really inform the next 2 years of Skills for Bees Cymru. The project is available down there on our website. You can see there. So do have a look, because the report is excellent, and I've only pulled out a few little bits and pieces here. So it was funded by the Welsh Government National Lottery Heritage Fund and delivered by the LERCs. As I've already said, with the premise that, you know, although we've got some of our rarest bumblebees, UK bumblebees, we didn't really know what the status of them was. So the first thing was the LERCs drew together as many data sets as possible from a variety of sources, but we focused, even though we did draw all the data for all of our 23 bumblebee species, we focused on the 5 Section 7s and the 2 scarce species, as I've already described. And then they did some lovely work on that data and produced all sorts of maps. Some of them are quite complicated and really in depth. There's loads of information to pull out of this report, so I'm only going to touch on it here really. So they did species coincidence maps, looked at recorder intensity, which is really important from my point of view, and also really nicely they looked at habitat association. So just to exemplify the map on the right, this is a species coincidence map of all of our 23 bumblebee species. So basically, every 10 kilometres square, they totaled up the number of species that has been recorded in there in total, you know, since the records began. So if the squares are dark red, that square has had between 19 and 23 of all of our Welsh bumblebees recorded in it at some time or another. And then going through to the lighter colours, if it's yellow, it's only had between 1 and 5 species recorded in it. So it presents as a much lower bumblebee diversity, if you like. So you can see these, as ever, the coastal areas tend to be dark, which darker red, more species. They tend to have the more preferable habitat to accommodate, you know, a greater variety of species. 2 squares in Wales with no records at all. I'm proud to say one of those now has 1 record, because I knew about these gaps. And when I was driving down from some field days home in the summer, I stopped in I think it was the right hand square, I can't remember now, and I recorded 1 bumblebee. I jumped out of the car and I recorded a buff-tailed bumblebee in the churchyard, just so that is now, it wasn't showing at the time, but now we only have 1 square with no records. But inevitably these squares, these colours, don't only show possible diversity of bumblebees, they show recorder effort as well. And there's lots of recorder effort in the south. There's so many people that come to the south and record bumblebees. And in, you know, some of these areas are lower in human population, etc. So they have fewer records. So it's a bit of a mix of where there are lots of species and where there are lots of people recording them. And similarly, this map is, so we've got 2 colourways here. So this is a map of recording effort, and the numbers in the squares, I hope you can see them. The numbers in the squares indicate the total number of records for that 10 kilometre square. And where they are, this is mixed up as well with the species coincidence. So you've still, so where you've got the red ones are where you've got at least one of the target species, one of the rare and scarce. And then the blue ones are the same numbers of species, but just the common ones. But you've also got the total number of records. So it's quite a complex map. But basically, if we just look at the numbers of records, you can see down here about around Newport wetlands, you've got, you know, there's 1,000 there, and you've got hundreds. Quite a lot on Castle Martin, which is a honeypot of people recording. And similarly, I think the Great Orme, I hope I'm not, I think that's the Great Orme there, has 1,668, and I think that's actually the highest number of records of any square. So even though we've got lower numbers in general, that spot, so I don't know who's responsible for a lot of those records there, but that's a really well recorded spot for bumblebees. So and basically all the blue squares are places where we've got none of the rare and scarce. That's what that's showing us, but whether or not they are actually there, we don't know. Okay, so that's one of their very colourful, very informative maps. And then they produced a series of these maps for each of our rare and scarce species, and these are so good. So the Lurks did habitat analysis for each of our rare and scarce species, and they came up with a core habitat. So this is for the brown-banded cardabee, Bombus humilis, and they came up with a core habitat, which seemed to be, from all the data, its preferential habitat, and then supporting habitat where it also occurred. And then basically, just looking here, we've just post 2,000 records, all the grey squares for Bombus humilis, where it actually occurs. You can see it does correspond with the nice red areas of core habitat, but there are some key areas for this particular species. So around, sort of down from the Harlech, that part of the coast, Morfa-Dyffryn, etc., where we've got lovely habitat and no records, and north of the Llŷn Peninsula as well, North Pembrokeshire coast. So for me, in targeting my project, I'm thinking this is where I want to be. I want to look at the places it's already occurred and see if it's still there, but let's get recording in some of these core habitat areas. And we've got these habitat association maps for each of our rare and scarce species, so we can start to target our efforts. Now, this doesn't look very readable or friendly table, but it's actually really lovely lovely bit of information. I'll simplify it for you in a sec. But basically down the left here, we've got our rare and scarce species, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 5 section 7 species and 2 plus 2. And then going across here, we've got our basically priority areas for each species for targeting our surveys. So based on the habitat present in each of these areas from the Habitat Association maps, they've defined where we need to be looking for each species. So for North Wales, so I've got a little yellow bee popping up. So don't worry about all of this. This is all south and mid Wales. So the first North Wales priority area is Snowdonia Park South. And we've got bilberry bumblebee and the moss carder as target areas for surveying. Okay, this part of North Wales is so under-recorded, so that's a priority. Then we've got second one, Bala to Corwen, so going up to sort of in a northeast direction. Again, looking for Monticola, the bilberry bumblebee, which is the little black square there. And then we've got South Gwynedd coast around Harlech, which is a real kind of potential hotspot. So we know we've got bilberry bumblebee, that's a tick, and moss carded tick. But then the black square broken banded or broken belted bumblebee we need to be looking for, and Bombus humilis, the brown carded. Those little clear squares there are ones where they're outside the current known range but could be there. Okay. Then going across, we've got the Llŷn Peninsula, another bit of a potential hotspot. So we need to be looking for brown banded carder. And again, broken belted. And Anglesey coast. Okay, so black square, brown banded carder, red shank carder, and broken belted. It has correct habitat for all of those. And moss carder, we know it to be there. And Clwydian range and the Dee estuary, part of Wales I've never explored, so it'd be lovely to go here. We need to look for brown banded carder, and bilberry and broken belted are already recorded there, but obviously it'd be good to find them again. And I've just turned that into a map because I thought some of you keen recorders might be really interested, just for you to see. So those are areas which have been identified as having priority habitat for specific rare species, but they've not been recorded there. And other rare species have, but it would be really good to know if they're still there and potentially set up monitoring to see how they're doing. Okay, but as I've said to Richard at Cofnod, actually, we mustn't forget that this whole area is largely under-recorded for all species. So even though I'd like to target some rare bee survey days here over the coming 2 years, I would like to work across the region to, meet volunteers, train volunteers, set up BeeWalks, do volunteer recording days all over North Wales as much as I possibly can. So I hope that map is useful for you if you're, in search of the rarer bees and the really good, nice habitat. Okay, so now I'm going to show you a map of our BeeWalk monitoring transects in Wales as of 2019. Sorry, it's a little bit out of date because last year's data was a bit hit and miss with COVID, and our new data is just about to come out now, just after Christmas. So bear with me on that. But basically, BeeWalk is our UK-wide monitoring scheme. It's very well designed, very robust citizen science monitoring scheme, just like butterfly conservation, where you walk a transect once a month for 6 months. with quite clear guidelines and support from the Trust. So this provides us with abundance data, in addition to all the distribution data that you've seen, and all species are included in BeeWalk. So in 2019, I'm sorry the dots are a little bit small, but basically the red dots across Wales represent our registered BeeWalks, and the blue dots represent BeeWalks where data was submitted. So you can see that a lot more BeeWalks are registered than are actually submitting data. So this is something I want to address as part of my project in terms of supporting people to sort of be more confident and carry on their transects with us. But you can also see in terms of registered BeeWalks, there are very, very few basically above sort of Aberystwyth north. There's a little cluster here, but considering the habitat we've got in North Wales, and basically there's one just inside Snowdonia National Park. So this is something I'd really like to sort of redress the balance here if I can, and try to set up sustainable and meaningful transects in North Wales, different North Wales areas. And just to sort of add a little bit of detail on that, this is a record heat map for BeeWalk records. BeeWalk records come to us, they do eventually go to the LERCs, but they come to us initially. And you can see that obviously the more red the colour, the more records have been submitted. And this is the South Wales area and the North Wales area. So even though those BeeWalks have been active, you know, we just haven't got the records really. So I need, you know, to work on that with people. Okay, so as you've probably guessed, my focus for the next 2 years is going to be on really sort of Ceredigion and North Wales to try and fill some of these gaps. So as I've already said, we've made a little start in 2021, and Richard and I worked together. It was a really good partnership, and we did quite a lot of online training, but I also came up for a couple of days, and we had 2 really nice days around the Conway area. And you know, we got some nice records. We got Bombus Janellus there, the Heath Bumblebee up on the frieze, and we also got some nice solitary bee records, if I remember rightly as well. Getting a bit distracted, but it wasn't enough. So in 2022 and 2023, what I'd like to do is offer training across North Wales for beginners, intermediate, BeeWalk and general ad hoc recording training. So just working with Cofnod to get people using the app and submitting their sightings. And I can work with groups like in a sequence of sessions. I don't just have to do a one-off, so we can build skills. I'd like to do volunteer training days, which don't have to be in those priority areas. They could be in anywhere where there are bumblebees. Like shown there, the RSPB reserve at Conway was perfect because we had loos and a cafe, but lots of bumblebees as well. So I'm willing to, come to places and have these volunteer field days and make them very much about recording at the same time. I can also offer sessions where I come up and we do BeeWalks in the field so that people feel confident in setting them up. And we could set up BeeWalks with people in groups or individually, etc. And also, I'd like to come up and target those priority habitat areas that I said earlier, perhaps towards the end of seasons when I've worked with people where we all come together and perhaps meet at these really lovely sites and have a rare bee blitz where we get out and about with as many eyes and nets as possible, and see what we can find in some of these beautiful locations across North Wales. So that's what I can offer. It is largely just me. So, we have to bear that in mind, but I can come up and I hope to come up and deliver lots of these things with you. So these are some of my volunteers looking at shrill card bees in the summer. That's why they look so happy. They're finding lots of rare things. So I can, if you're an individual and you want to do training, I can talk to you about that, and we can do some online courses where we invite as many people as possible. If you're part of a volunteer group attached to a reserve or a, I don't know, community nature reserve or whatever it is, and you think you'd like to start recording bumblebees, you can get in touch with me, because I can look at working with groups. And I think what's proved successful this year is doing a mix of online and field sessions, because online means that we can have as many people as possible doing the theory, but then I come up and work with smaller groups doing the field sessions. If you are a land manager, or you run a reserve, you're a warden, whatever it is, if you've got a group of volunteers and you'd like to do monitoring on your site, that would be fantastic. I know some of the NRW sites in North Wales are right in those areas of key habitat, so that'd be something I'd like to work on. You can go on my mailing list if you're just interested in finding out a bit more without making any sort of commitments. That's fine. And you can email me. There's my email address. I'll leave that up for a moment. And if you email me, please could you put North Wales into the subject line so that I can collate all of my contacts for North Wales, and I can start to plan how I can best deliver all of this to the people that are interested. I've already got some contacts that I'd like to work with. I know the Countryside Service around the estuary, staff there have been in touch, and at Glyndŵr University and a few others, also around Bangor. But it'd be lovely to hear from you, if you are interested in being involved or training next year. And I will be training from quite early on in 2022 to get the season in. So do get in touch with me soon. And if you're, interested in other aspects of bumblebee conservation, we've got wider volunteering opportunities which aren't around recording. We are going to be looking at increasing that in Wales. So it could be just giving leaflets out, or being on a stand, or just helping me a bit with a project. If you'd like to contact me about that, just put volunteering into the heading, and you can also join, and there's a membership section on our website that you can have a look at. So that's another way, obviously, to support the work. Okay, oops, I'm going to finish there. That's chocolate Bombus pretorum male, early bumblebee there, which one of our volunteers made to end off one of our events. It is a lovely project to be involved with, and I really, really hope that some of you will take an interest in this, and that we can do more and find out more about bumblebees in North Wales next year. Okay, thank you very much.